The sky was still dark when the Empire ships came down like silent monsters with black metal skins reflecting the last stars above the hills where the orphanage stood. Alone with broken windows and cold wind moving through the cracked walls, the children were still asleep, dreaming of warm bread and the voices of parents. They would never know when the shadows fell over the yard, and the ground shook with the weight of landing soldiers in black armor with glowing blue eyes moving without sound as they spread across the yard, pulling the teachers from their beds, pulling the children from thin blankets. With metal hands cold and strong, the children cried as they were dragged across the dirt. The teachers screamed as they tried to fight with shaking hands using broomsticks and kitchen knives, but the Empire soldiers did not slow. They hit the teachers down with silent strikes, ignoring the tears, ignoring the begging, ignoring the fear in small eyes as they lined the children. In the mud under the cold gray sky above, the ships hovered like dead gods, waiting, watching. The children tried to hold each other, but the soldiers ripped them apart, scanning their small faces with blue lights, searching for something. The children did not know what they were searching for. They only knew the hands were cold and the voices were empty as the soldiers counted them. Like numbers, like cattle, the teachers crawled across the mud, whispering to the children to be brave, whispering that it would be over soon, whispering that they would not be taken. But the Empire soldiers raised their weapons, pointing them at the children, who closed their eyes because they did not want to see the end. The sky was empty above them, the hills silent except for the soft wind moving through the grass. The ships began to glow with thin lines of light running along their bellies like the veins of dead stars, and the children felt the warmth of tears on their cheeks, mixing with the cold dirt as they held hands, waiting for the sound that would take them away. The teachers reached for the children with broken fingers, blood in the dirt, as they tried to shield them with their own bodies, but the soldiers pulled them back, stepping over them, stepping closer to the children. The lights in the sky grew brighter as the engines of the Empire ships prepared to fire. The air smelled of burnt metal and the sharp, bitter scent of fear. The smallest child looked up at the soldiers with wide eyes, the reflection of the cold blue lights in them, as he whispered for his mother, who was buried in a grave far away, under a tree that no longer bloomed. The soldiers did not hear him, or they did not care. The wind moved across the yard, carrying the soft cries of children and the last prayers of teachers across the dirt as the Empire ships began to open the sky with the hum of weapons that had silenced 100 worlds before, and above them all the empty dawn waited to see if Earth would answer. Far away in a bunker built beneath the bones of a city that had burned long ago, the woman opened her eyes to the sound of the alarms that painted the walls red with pulsing light. She did not move quickly because she never needed to rush. She had learned long ago that death would wait for her, and that she would never need to run to catch it. She sat up on the edge of the narrow metal bed, her boots touching the cold floor, her breath calm as the alarms screamed of Empire ships over the hills, and children screaming in mud. She reached for the black case under her bed, pulling it open, with careful fingers revealing weapons that smelled of oil and blood, and the cold metal comfort that had been her only companion for too many years. Her eyes were gray, like steel, like clouds before a storm, and they did not blink as she lifted each weapon, checking the weight, checking the charges, checking the blades for chips, as if she were preparing tea instead of preparing to kill the screens. On the wall flickered with feeds from broken satellites, showing the orphanage in the hills, the children in the mud, the teachers on their knees, the Empire soldiers with blue eyes and black armor standing over them, weapons raised. The woman watched, with no expression, as a teacher crawled over the dirt to pull a small boy into her arms, before a soldier ripped him away. The woman did not look away as the soldiers lined the children up under the glowing ships. She did not look away as the soldiers raised their weapons. She only reached into the case, pulling out the thin black gloves that fit over her hands, like another layer of skin, pulling out the old necklace with the small metal tag that rattled softly as it settled against her throat. The tag was scratched and worn, but the numbers were still clear. 9,000 kills in quiet files, 9,000 kills in the shadows, 9,000 kills for a world that would never say thank you. She pulled her hair back into a tight knot, slipping the headset over her ear as she connected to the gunship hidden in the tunnels above the city. The engines of the gunship hummed softly, waiting for her, waiting for the order to rise into the sky. She looked once more at the screen, at the children, standing in the mud, at the Empire soldiers, standing with weapons raised, at the ships glowing above like hungry mouths. She did not feel fear, she did not feel rage, she felt the cold certainty of purpose that had guided every step since the day She picked up a blade and decided that the Empire would learn to fear the woman who had nothing left to lose. She stood, and the lights of the bunker reflected in her eyes, as she whispered to the screen, telling the children to wait, telling them to hold on, telling them that Earth had not forgotten them. As she walked toward the door, her boots striking the metal floor in a steady promise of the storm she was bringing with her, she moved through the narrow corridor of the bunker with steady steps, as the lights above flickered with the hum of old power cells. The air smelled of metal and dust, and the memory of smoke that would never leave the walls. Her boots echoed as she passed the empty rooms where the ghosts of other soldiers seemed to watch her with silent eyes. She did not look at them, she did not speak to them. She only walked with the same purpose that had carried her across battlefields where the Empire had burned cities and left nothing but ashes. She reached the armory door, placing her hand on the scanner, the machine clicking softly as it recognized the code in her blood. The door opened with a slow hiss, revealing racks of weapons and crates of ammunition. Blades lined the walls like teeth of quiet beasts waiting to be chosen. Rifles rested in locked cradles. Grenades and charges sat in metal boxes, marked with warnings in languages the Empire had tried to erase. She walked past them all until she reached the far wall, where a single black locker stood alone. She opened it, pulling out the armor, piece by piece, the black plates marked with scars from old fights, the thin mesh that flexed under her fingers as she pulled it over her skin, the gloves fitting tight, the boots locking in place, the helmet resting against her hip as she lifted the small blades and slid them into their hidden sheaths across her body until they felt like extensions of her bones. She checked the pistols, their weight familiar in her hands as she loaded them with quiet clicks. She attached the holsters to her thighs, the railgun heavy across her back, the drones resting in their cradles on her shoulders like silent birds waiting for her signal. She stood in front of the cracked mirror at the end of the armory, looking at the reflection that stared back at her. The face was older, now marked by lines that spoke of sleepless nights and battles fought in dark places. The eyes were empty of fear, empty of doubt, only filled with the cold readiness that had always been there since the day the Empire took everything from her. She did not whisper prayers. She did not promise vengeance. She only nodded once at her reflection before turning away, walking back through the corridor toward the hangar, where the gunship waited, the engines growling softly in the shadows. As she approached the ramp, lowering with a hiss of air, she stepped inside the metal closing around her like a promise. The screens flickered on, showing the hills where the orphanage stood. The children still in the mud, the Empire soldiers still with weapons raised the ships above, glowing with the hunger of monsters that had forgotten what it meant to bleed. She placed her hand on the controls, the engines roaring louder as the lights inside turned red, the gunship lifting from the ground, shaking the dust from the walls as it rose through the old tunnels, breaking through the hidden doors above as it climbed into the dark sky, carrying the woman who had nothing left but the promise that she would not let the Empire take the children without learning what it meant to awaken the last blade of Earth. The gunship tore through the clouds with a scream of engines that split the morning sky. Into the winds rushed around the hull as the woman guided the ship lower, her eyes locked on the screens showing the hills below, where the orphanage lay in the cold mud, and the children stood in their thin clothes facing the Empire soldiers who pointed weapons at small chests and small faces. The teachers were on their knees whispering prayers with cracked voices as the Empire ships above glowed with charging energy. The woman adjusted the controls, her fingers steady as she armed the drones locked under the wings of the gunship. The engines roared louder as she broke through the last layer of clouds, and the hills opened below her like a wound in the earth. The Empire soldiers looked up at the sudden shadow that covered them, their blue eyes reflecting the gunship as it hovered above the yard engines. Rumbling like a beast that had come to hunt, the children looked up to their small faces streaked with tears and dirt as they held each other in the mud. The teachers reached for them, trying to cover them with thin arms as if flesh could stop the fire that was waiting in the sky. The Empire soldiers shouted in their cold voices, aiming their weapons at the gunship as the woman opened the hatch, the wind rushing inside, grabbing at her hair and her armor as she stepped to the edge, the light from the rising sun catching the black plates of her armor. As she looked down at the yard, her eyes cold as the winter that had taken her family long ago, she could see the smallest child looking up at her, a small hand raised as if reaching for something. He could not see. The Empire soldiers fired beams of cold light at the gunship, but the woman had already jumped from the hatch, falling through the air like a blade. The engines of her suit roared as she adjusted her descent landing in the mud with a crack of thunder that shook the yard. The children screamed, but did not run as the woman stood straight, pulling the pistols from her hips as the Empire soldiers turned to her, their weapons glowing with the cold promise of death. The woman moved before they could fire her pistols, whispering in the dawn, as beams of silent death struck the first soldier in the throat, the second in the eye, the third in the heart. The children watched with wide eyes as the woman moved across the mud like a shadow, like a promise that death could bleed the Empire. Soldiers tried to regroup, but the woman was already moving, already cutting with the knives that slipped into her hands, already reloading without looking as she stepped past the bodies of the fallen, her eyes locked on the soldiers who still pointed their weapons at the children. The drones above, activated by a signal from her suit, screaming as they dropped beams of heat and light into the ranks of the Empire soldiers who tried to hide behind the thin walls of the orphanage, but the drones burned through metal and flesh without mercy. The woman kept moving through the yard, every step a promise that the Empire would not take the children, not while she still drew breath. The yard was filled with smoke and the sharp scent of burnt metal as the woman moved through the mud. Her black armor streaked with ash and the splatter of Empire blood that steamed against the cold morning. The children pressed against the broken walls of the orphanage, their eyes wide and silent as they watched her walk past the bodies of the Empire soldiers who had fallen with their weapons still in their hands, their blue eyes dimming in the dirt. The woman reloaded her pistols with smooth hands, dropping the empty cells into the mud without looking down, her eyes always scanning the sky above where the Empire ships hovered like silent vultures, the lights along their bellies growing brighter as they charged for another strike. She could see the heat building in the air around the ships, like a shimmer that promised death. She could feel the engines of her drones humming above her, ready for her signal. As the teachers crawled through the mud to pull the children back toward the shattered walls, the woman raised her hand, giving a sharp signal that sent the drones screaming into the sky, where they fired beams of heat at the underbellies of the Empire ships, cutting lines of burning light across the cold metal. As the ships shuddered in the air, the engines stuttering with bursts of blue fire, one of the ships began to drop smoke trailing from its side as the drones tore into it with relentless precision. The woman moved toward the center of the yard, where the smallest child still stood, his eyes locked on hers, as if he could see something in her that the others could not. She knelt down in the mud, her armor groaning as she lowered herself to his level, her eyes cold but soft as she reached out a gloved hand to touch his shoulder, telling him without words that he would not die. Here, not today, not while she still lived. The Empire ships above screamed as they fired beams of energy that tore into the ground around the yard, burning craters into the mud and throwing chunks of earth into the air. The shockwaves knocked the teachers and children to the ground, but the woman stood, her armor shielding the child behind her. As she raised her railgun from her back, the heavy weapon locking into her shoulder with a hiss of steam, she aimed at the nearest ship, calculating the distance with a cold, steady mind, her finger tightening on the trigger as the railgun roared. With a sound that split the morning, the shot pierced the underbelly of the Empire ship, tearing through metal and wires and systems that screamed as they died. The ship shuddered in the sky before breaking apart in a silent bloom of fire and black smoke, the debris falling like rain around the yard as the children cried out in fear and wonder. The woman moved again, not stopping, not slowing, as she targeted the next ship, her drones returning to her, circling like silent birds waiting for her command. The teachers looked at her with eyes that could not believe what they were seeing as she stood alone against the Empire, with the cold promise of death in her hands and the silent promise of protection in her eyes. She moved through the enemy ranks like a ghost, her boots silent on the metal floors, her breath, even her eyes, calm as she counted the distance between herself and each target. She did not hesitate, she did not pause, she did not wait for them to see her before she moved, her hands swift as the wind slicing the air, as she pulled the rifle from the nearest soldier, before he could even raise his eyes, and she turned it on the others. Without blinking, they fell in silence, one by one, their bodies hitting the floor with dull thuds that did not echo, because the fear was too thick in the air, the fear of something they could not understand, something they could not fight, because she was not just a soldier, she was not just a killer, she was a storm that had been waiting to be unleashed for too long, and they were the unfortunate ones who saw it when she walked forward into the smoke. She saw their eyes widen as they realized she would not stop, she would not slow down, as she moved from cover to cover, her body low, her mind calculating each shot, each breath, each moment, as if time itself had bent around her to let her finish what she had come to do. She did not flinch when bullets passed by her head. She did not look away when blood splashed across her visor. She kept moving. She kept counting every step, every shot, every scream that she would add to the list she carried in the silence of her mind, the list of every enemy who thought they could take what was left of the world she had fought for. They tried to regroup, they tried to surround her, but they did not know what it meant to be hunted by someone who had nothing left to lose. They fired their rifles, they threw their blades, they screamed in languages that made the air shake, but it did not matter because she was closer now, close enough to see the fear in their eyes, close enough to see their weapons shaking in their hands, as they realized that death had come for them in the form of a woman who had walked across burning cities, who had crawled through fields of ash, who had buried too many children to ever forgive herself for resting. She moved with precision, her mind clear as she grabbed the arm of the next soldier, twisting it until the weapon clattered to the floor. She turned the soldier into a shield as the others fired, and their bullets found only their own friend, and she moved again, stepping over the fallen as she pressed forward. They tried to close the doors, they tried to call for reinforcements, but the power was down, the lights were flickering, the emergency alarms screaming, and all they could see was the black shadow of the woman who kept coming, kept walking, kept killing. Because she had a promise to keep, she had a mission that burned in her blood, she had a purpose that nothing could take from her, and as she reached the central corridor where the leader waited, she did not slow down. She raised the rifle she had taken from the first soldier, and she fired, without hesitation, clearing the path until there was nothing left between her and the one who dared to threaten the children, who dared to touch the last light of earth. And she kept moving. He tried to explain as she stepped into the central chamber, where the air was heavy with smoke and the lights flashed red against the steel walls. He raised his hands, slowly, his eyes tired, his voice shaking as he tried to speak over the alarms, saying he needed the child, saying his world was dying, saying the child held power that could save millions on distant worlds, where families were starving, where cities were crumbling under endless war. But she did not care. She had heard all the reasons before. She had seen the eyes of soldiers who believed they were doing the right thing as they stepped over the bodies of children, who believed they were saving their people as they burned the homes of others. She had watched planets die under the same promises. She had seen too many leaders with shaking hands and sad eyes who tried to explain why they had to take and take and take until nothing was left. And she did not care because she remembered the cold nights when she stood guard outside the bunkers where children slept with fear in their small breaths. She remembered the way their hands reached for her in the dark, the way they trusted her to keep them safe, the way they believed she could stop the nightmares that walked in the shape of men with guns. And she remembered why she came here. She remembered why she stepped over the bodies of soldiers, why she kept walking through the screams and the fire, why she did not stop even when the weight of her memories tried to pull her down. She remembered the children pressed against the glass windows of the orphanage as the ships came down from the sky. She remembered the small hand that tapped against the glass, as if asking if she would really come, and she came because no one else would. She came because the world had forgotten the promise it made to protect them, and she did not care about reasons. She did not care about the dying worlds. She did not care about his fear. She saw him standing there, in his polished armor with his trembling hands, and she saw another man, in another war, making promises, with shaking breath before he pressed the button that ended a city. And she raised her weapon slowly, her steps even, her eyes cold as she looked at him and told him without words that he would not take any child today, that he would not take hope from this place, that he would not write another tragedy in the ashes of the innocent. He tried to speak again, tried to reach for something at his side, but she was faster. She moved like the whisper of death across the silent chamber as she fired the first shot that knocked him back against the console, and then the second shot that silenced his last plea for mercy. She stepped closer, looking down at him as he fell to the floor with wide eyes, the alarms still screaming, the lights still flashing, but all she could hear was the promise she had made to the children. And she turned away from him, leaving his reasons and his fear behind as she prepared to walk back through the halls she had cleared for them, ready to tell them it was over for now, ready to tell them they were safe for now. She stepped out of the chamber, her boots leaving streaks on the metal floor, as she moved through the halls where the bodies of soldiers lay silent now, the alarms still echoing in the empty corridors. As lights flickered above her, she could hear the distant cries of children behind locked doors, the soft sounds of their fear trembling in the cold air. She kept moving, her rifle heavy in her hands, as she checked every corner, every passage, every stairwell, to be certain there were no more threats to be certain no one would rise again to take what they came for. The smell of smoke and burned wires filled the air, the walls scorched with the marks of battle, the steel torn by bullets and blasts. But she did not pause, she did not slow, her breath steady as she stepped over the fallen, her mind clear with the single promise she had made, the promise she had kept. When no one else would, she found the caretakers huddled near the generator room, their eyes wide when they saw her, the fear and relief mixing in their tired faces as they clutched the children close to their chests. The children stared at her with eyes too big for their small faces, eyes that had seen too much already, eyes that still held a fragile hope she had come to protect. She nodded to the caretakers without speaking, her voice still silent from the hours of fighting, from the weight of memory pressing against her ribs, as she looked at the children and saw the small hand that tapped the glass that day when the sky opened and they thought they would be taken. She saw the same child looking at her now, the fear slowly leaving their eyes as they realized they were safe, at least for now. She motioned for them to move, to gather what they could, to leave the orphanage before the scavengers came, before the world remembered this place and tried to take it again. She led them through the halls, the caretakers carrying bags of water and food, the children clutching soft blankets and each other. As they followed her footsteps through the ash and silence, she moved ahead, checking every corridor, every stairwell, listening for the hum of a weapon or the click of a boot that would mean another threat. Another fight. But there was nothing now, only the quiet that came after violence, the quiet that felt heavy and endless. As they reached the entrance where the morning light was breaking through the smoke, she stepped outside first, her rifle raised, her eyes scanning the sky for the black shapes of ships that might return. But the sky was empty, the dawn a pale gray as it touched the broken ground, the wind cold as it carried the scent of smoke and blood away. She turned to the children, motioning them forward as they stepped out into the light, their small faces squinting as they looked at the world that was still theirs for now. She stood there watching them step onto the cracked earth, their bare feet leaving prints in the dust as they moved forward. Together she had kept them safe, she had kept her promise for now, and that was enough for today. She stood at the edge of the road as the children walked past her, their small hands reaching for the light that slipped through the clouds, their eyes blinking in the pale dawn. As they stepped into a world that was still broken but alive, she watched them walk one by one, their small feet silent on the cracked ground, the caretakers guiding them forward, whispering promises of food and water and shelter, even though the caretakers themselves were afraid, even though the world they were walking into was still dangerous and hungry and waiting. She stood there with her rifle across her chest, her visor cracked from the last shot that shattered the silence, her gloves torn and dark from the fight. But she did not care about the blood on her suit, she did not care about the cold wind on her face. She only cared about the children moving forward, because they were the last hope, the last reason she kept breathing. She turned her eyes to the horizon, where the cities burned slow under gray skies, where the towers lay broken and the streets were empty, where the old flags still hung in tatters from forgotten buildings. She knew there would be more fights. She knew there would be more ships coming down with black shadows across the sky. She knew the world would not give these children peace for long, but today she had kept her promise. Today she had stopped the monsters from taking them. Today she had given them one more sunrise, and that was enough for now. The children stopped at the edge of the road, turning to look at her, their eyes wide and quiet as they watched her standing there in the dawn. Some of them raised their hands, small waves that meant thank you without words. Some of them smiled, the kind of small, tired smiles that children give when they are too tired to cry. She raised her hand in return, a small motion that meant she saw them, that she would remember them, that they were worth every moment of her fight. The caretakers called to the children, telling them to keep moving, telling them it was time to find shelter, telling them they were safe now, and the children turned away, slowly stepping into the light as the wind picked up, carrying the ash away from the burned road, carrying the scent of smoke and steel into the empty sky. She watched them until they were small shapes in the distance, until their voices were gone, until the only sound left was the quiet wind. She turned away from the road and walked back toward the orphanage, her boots heavy on the ground, her breath steady as she looked at the broken doors and the empty halls. She would search the place one more time. She would check for any threat, any hidden danger, any last shadows waiting to take what she had protected. She would stay close for now. She would wait in the silence with her rifle ready, with her eyes on the sky, because she knew they would come again, and when they did, she would be there. Because they attacked Earth's orphanage, and she was the woman with 9,000 confirmed kills, and she would keep her promise again and again, until the world remembered what it meant to protect its children.